We've learned how to cast on and to knit and purl different stitches. The next thing is getting your knitting off your needles. That is referred to as casting off. We're going to do two types of cast off. We're going to do a plain knit cast off, which is the most commonly used cast off, and then we're going to do a cast off in pattern. To start a basic cast off, you knit the first stitch. You then knit the next stitch. This is where you begin the cast off. You take the tip of your left needle and insert it underneath and into the first stitch that you knit. You then take that stitch over the tip of your needle and the other stitch that you've just knit. So we'll say it again. You then knit the next stitch, tip of your needle into the first stitch on the needle, and then transfer that over the needle stitch you've just knit. Tip of your needle into the stitch, over the other stitch. Now something to be aware of is that it's very easy when you're doing this to take both stitches off the needle. So what I'm doing is in my right hand I am holding the yarn a little bit more tightly as I take the stitch, the first stitch over the second stitch, and that gives me more control. You continue doing this until you get to one stitch left on your right hand needle and one stitch left on your left hand needle, and we'll look at what happens there in just a sec. When you come to the point where you have one stitch left on the left needle, you knit that stitch as normal. You then take this first stitch on your needle over the second, which leaves you with one stitch on your right hand needle. You cut your thread, leaving yourself a few inches to tuck in your end, and then you bring the yarn through your stitch. Now when you're doing this, a lot of people will pull that straight up and it creates a little bit of a rabbit ear. So what I say is bring it down to the level of the knitting itself rather than pulling it straight up, and then gently ease that stitch into place. This type of cast off is not a particularly stretchy cast off, but it is one that you'll see commonly used. If your pattern requires a different or more stretchy cast off, it should tell you, but we'll look at a lot of different cast offs in Knit School, but this will get you started. The second most likely cast off instruction you will see in a pattern is cast off in pattern, and this is often used when you're doing ribs, necklines, cuffs, etc. So what we're doing here is, in this we have the 2x2 rib that we knit previously, and we want to cast that off in pattern. And in this we have stitches that would be purled on this side as well as knit stitches. We'll just pause here briefly. The question, what pattern, is very common when you're told to cast off in pattern, and the general rule is that you will work the stitches as part of your cast off as if you were working the row that would have come next in the pattern. So for example, in the version we see here, I would be doing 2 knit stitches and 2 purl stitches. So when I'm casting them off, instead of knitting all of the stitches, I will knit the knits and purl the purls. We will look further at how you tell which stitches are coming up next when we do reading your knitting and pattern reading. So these first 2 stitches are knit. So in the same way as I started the other cast off, I knit my first stitch, I knit my second stitch, and then I bring the first stitch on my needle over the second stitch and take it off. Now I come to a purl stitch. So in the same way that I change for purling, I bring my yarn through my needles and then purl the next stitch. I then need to bring the first stitch over my second stitch, so I need to move my yarn out of my way. I definitely recommend giving yourself a bit of tension here, because as you'll see, it is easier to let the second stitch slip off your needle very quickly. I then purl the next stitch as it's a purl stitch, and then I do the same again. I bring my first stitch on my needle over my second stitch. I then bring my yarn back through my needles, ready to knit my next stitch, as I did when we were working knit and purls on the same row. I then knit my next stitch and go back to taking my stitches over those knit stitches. You then continue doing that until the very end, and when you come to the end you take your yarn through your last stitch as you did in the previous version. As I've said before, you will see a lot of different versions of this particular one, so you may have a one knit, one purl situation, or you may have multiple knits and a single purl or other combinations, but it's always the same way. You work the stitch that's up next in the way you would work it if it were being knit in an ordinary row. So we'll just look at this cast off, and you can see that when you pull it, it's a lot stretchier than on the first cast off that we did. And you can also see that it's a different shape. It's a little bit more bumpy because it goes in and out with your different knit and purl stitches. If we then look at it with the first cast off that we did, you'll see that there is a great deal more stretch in this. Part of that is to do with the rib, but also it is to do with how it's been cast off. There will be a whole series of different cast offs available in the Core Techniques library very shortly.